Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Trial by Podcast by our lovely 2025 grads. So today we're tackling the topic of defamation and specifically diss tracks. So diss tracks have always been a cornerstone of hip hop, and this started in New York back in the day. And rappers would engage in street battles and lyrically spit at each other. And this has gradually transitioned now into actually recording diss tracks. And this is now record companies making millions of dollars off diss tracks being published. So the first ever major diss track that was recorded was actually by UTFO. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of them.
I've never heard of them. Who are UTFO?
I've never heard of them.
I have no idea either.
Okay, that's it.
They made a song called Roxanne, Roxanne. And
I know that
Yeah, I know that song. Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
Classic.
So it might not be a household name, but it was a significant time as it kind of sparked what we know today as a diss track. And then this set the stage for future artists to start recording diss tracks on each other. But an interesting thing that kind of comes out of it in a legal sense is the issue of defamation. So the rise in popularity of diss tracks have in recent times resulted in more than just like a rap beef. It's actually defamation which has been litigated. And then the publication of these songs has actually led to the publishers being liable. And we've seen this recently in the Drake and Kendrick beef. But before we get into that, there's actually been more cases. So if you guys know 50 Cent.
Yeah.
I know
everyone
the
loves
one.
50 Cent.
Everyone loves a bit of
Yeah.
50 Cent.
He was actually sued by Rick Ross for
Really?
defamation
Okay.
over a diss track. He didn't succeed, but it was just an interesting one because it was the first time where I guess a big household name rapper was sued for defamation.
Yeah.
So at law, for a diss track to be defamatory, it needs to satisfy these three elements. So the song needs to make a false statement about the party. People need to believe it as fact and not entertainment. And it caused real damage to reputation or income. So now, getting back to Drake and Kendrick. So two of the most streamed artists in the room. And then I know that a couple of us are 0.000, as many zeros as you want, 1% listeners in the room right now.
Might be me.
So Drake has actually filed a lawsuit against Universal Music Group, and that's Kendrick's label, but they also published Drake's music as well, interestingly, over his song Not Like Us. So he claims it spread false and harmful information and accusations about him, and the label damaged his reputation by promoting the song. So this lawsuit actually raises a question of what free speech is entertainment protected? And this case could have serious implications about artistic expression, which is a big thing in the US with so much music. So we'll delve further into the details of the case and how it would play out in different jurisdictions, and if we'll have to edit our playlists and get rid of some of the diss tracks we have in there.
Well, in terms of the lawsuit itself, it was quite interesting because Drake's actually filed it not against Kendrick Lamar, the singer of the song, but rather against the publisher, which I'm pretty sure Shashank just said is also his own publisher. That he's put forward a few different allegations, but interestingly, there were three that were of note in terms of different intruders that had accessed his actual property following on from everything. For instance, on the 7th of May, there were a group of armed assailants that stopped in front of his residence and were yelling profanities at Drake. And in fact, one of them actually shot one of his security guards, which was quite interesting to learn. I hadn't heard about that.
I couldn't even believe when I saw like the actual photo on the...
there was a photo
because
of that.
it was a photo of... No, not the photo of that, but the photo that was on the album was Drake's house. With
Linda's house, yeah.
It's crazy.
Which is, all kinds of interesting with the actual, the pinpoints themselves and used in the criminal justice system. That was quite interesting.
Yeah.
And as Shashank said, there were various allegations made which essentially accused Drake of being a pedophile and call for retribution against him. And obviously Drake alleges that those were false. We sort of already touched on the album image as well, but various lyrics that allude to these allegations included certified pedophile, a predator who should be placed on neighborhood watch, Malibu most wanted, and then references to prison in the sense of cell block 1, let alone the hey, hey, run for your life, or warp, 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 fuck 'em up, which sort of all bolstered the image that he was a pedophile involved in sex trafficking at one point there. And essentially, as Shashank said, it's been streamed billions of times, and Drake alleges that that's destroyed his reputation in that regard, because most people apparently assume he is a pedophile now. But yeah, essentially Drake claims that all of these accusations and the physical threats have destroyed his reputation and brand, and constitute defamatory material. It'll be interesting. Our plan is to take a look at the US and Australia and sort of see how that all ties in, because I haven't heard much about US law in respect to that.
Yeah.
I know. It's super interesting. I feel like comparing US and Australia, once you actually look into it, it's quite bizarre seeing how different the standards actually are. So I'm going to head into like the US standard to start. So in the States, defamation is rooted in this landmark case called New York Times versus Sullivan, and it's from 1964. This Supreme Court ruling, it created a standard for defamation claims, especially when public figures were involved. And so the court ruled that public officials and later public figures have to prove something called actual malice to win a defamation case. So I'm sure everyone's probably wondering what actual malice is. I mean, it's not really a term we throw around on the day-to-day. Well, it's not just about proving whether something is false or damaging. It's actually about proving that the defendant either knew the statement was false or that they were reckless about whether it was true or not. And this is a pretty high bar. And in a way, it sort of sets out to protect the right to freedom of speech under the US Constitution, which isn't something that we have in Australia, which I guess is probably one of the main reasons why there's such a distinct difference. So for someone like Drake, who, I mean, we can all admit is definitely a public figure, he would need to prove that UMG knew the statements were false or were reckless in not knowing before they could be held accountable. And for Drake, it's actually not an easy case to win, which is why public figures often have to deal with a lot more public criticism without it being easy to sue. I think America just places so much value on freedom of speech, and they kind of see it as if you're a public figure already, like you've kind of allowed your rights to be slightly more encroached.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting. Because if you take it from a New South Wales perspective, in terms of what Drake would need to prove, he would need to prove that in the eyes of the ordinary reasonable reader, which in this case would be the ordinary reasonable consumer of rap music, that the song damages his reputation or leads others to shun or avoid him. Notably, if Drake's reputation hasn't been lowered or harmed in some way, he would likely be unsuccessful in actually establishing an allegation in New South Wales. And he'd essentially... The steps to establish defamation are that he needs to show it was published to a third person, which I guess in the scheme of things it clearly was, that the song identifies him, and that he would, and then he has to go through all the negative imputations that essentially are defamatory, that he alleges are defamatory. Yeah.
No, it's super interesting. And I feel like one of like the most interesting things and what took a lot of people by surprise was that Drake isn't actually going against Kendrick.
Yeah.
He's choosing to go against UMG. So a lot of people probably asking why. And the reason that sort of Drake's team has said is it's because he believes that UMG played a role in distributing and promoting false and defamatory content. This sort of adds an extra layer to the case because UMG is not just hosting content, they're actually actively pushing it out. And this is a big deal because record labels like UMG don't usually face that kind of scrutiny of platforms like Twitter or Facebook. So that's why this case could actually sort of have major waves for labels and how they have to handle controversial content. So let's flip on the other side of the world to Australia, where defamation laws are a bit different. In Australia, the Defamation Act 2005 says that anyone who publishes defamatory content can be held liable, even if they didn't create it themselves. And this includes companies that distribute or facilitate defamatory material, which brings us back to UMG. So the key case was Fairfax, which was in 2021. And the High Court ruled that media outlets and even social media operators could be held liable for defamatory third-party comments if they facilitated or encouraged their publication. This creates a much broader net for responsibility than what we see in the US. In fact, it actually forces publishers and digital platforms to be much more cautious about what content they allow to circulate, which is a lot to think about, because I feel like when people post on Facebook, you'd never actually think that Facebook themselves could be held liable for what you're saying. Like, you kind of always think it's your own personal thing, but the fact that it can be sort of the larger platform is sort of really bizarre, at least to me.
I was reading a case yesterday about like Google. Someone sued a company. I'll get into it later, but about a Google review.
Really?
Wow. How do you filter it, right? Like,
it sort of opens the floodgates
so
in that respect.
Exactly. And I mean, that makes me think about my dad, because my dad's a chronic Google reviewer. Like, it's sort of happened in his old age. He loves, I hope he's not listening to this, but he loves putting out a Google review. I'm like, Dad, watch out. Anyway, moving on to sort of content moderation and whether it's the responsibility of the publisher. In the US, platforms like Facebook or YouTube are generally protected by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which means they're not actually liable for anything posted by users. But the thing is that UMG is a record label, not just a platform, and they actually actively promote and distribute content, which means they might not have the same protections. In Australia, the courts are much stricter, so simply hosting or helping spread defamatory content could lead you in legal trouble. So that's just a massive difference, because in Australia, you can kind of see where the outcome's going to go. But in Australia, in the US, there actually hasn't been this kind of case involving like record labels to this degree. So I think that's why everyone's kind of waiting and watching to see what happens.
It'll be so interesting to see how it all plays out.
Definitely.
Especially it's so early on in the days, because it was only published the beginning of 2025.
I still remember it. We were talking about how it was like fueling our gym.
I don't think I've ever worked out harder in my life.
That's so interesting in terms of the different challenges that are posed in content moderation and what this song represents. I suppose I'll discuss a little bit about what the possible defences that might be raised by UMG if this case were to play out in New South Wales. So essentially there's various defences. There's 11 defences under the New South Wales Defamation Act in 2005. There's the defence of justification and contextual truth, which essentially are quite similar, and UMG would have to prove that the imputations of the song are substantially true. However, in the context of the allegations and where there's no formal complaints or charges, it would be unlikely that Drake would be established as a pedophile. There's the defence of absolute privilege and the publication being a public document or shared in a fair report of proceedings of public concern, which is ultimately not relevant here. A further defence is in respect to public interest, and UMG would likely again be unsuccessful if they attempted to allege that the publication was a matter of public interest. This is on numerous grounds, but mostly in respect to where the song fails to distinguish between suspicions, allegations, or proven facts. It's essentially all claims. It is uncertain, if any, what steps were taken by UMG to verify the actual sources of the allegations before it was published. And given that the imputations do not relate to the performance of any public functions or activities by Drake, again, unlikely to succeed in that area. UMG may also try to argue that the publication falls under the defence of qualified privilege. However, it is unlikely to be proven that there was a genuine or apparent interest of rap music consumers that the song be published with all of these allegations. The publication would not meet the defense again for publication in a scientific or academic journal, strictly on the basis it is a creative expression. And then UMG hypothetically could argue that the publication formed an honest opinion and that the lyrics are expressions of opinion made by UMG and not actually statements of fact. However, again, the publication would likely fail to meet the requirements as it does not relate to a matter of public interest, nor could it be argued that it is based on proper material, given the actual hard evidence at hand. Another defense is that a publication was made by a digital intermediary. However, again, probably unsuccessful on the basis that the UMG are the primary publishers of the song. And this similarly relates to the defense of innocent dissemination. And given that they were the first or primary distributor of the song, it's unlikely that that would succeed either. So essentially, no defenses are available as it stands on the facts we have.
I was about to say, sounds like a lot of defences, but not too much luck for UMG.
Not much defense, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately for them.
That's actually super interesting.
Yeah.
But in like tying into that, so like New South Wales actually, we've had so many defamation cases lately that they've actually introduced a new section of the Defamation Act. It's called Section 10A. And this deals with the topic of serious harm. So for it to actually be defamation, there needs to amount to serious harm.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is in response to obviously like so many frivolous defamation cases, and the courts are just inundated with just people claiming they've been defamed when, you know, it's very trivial. So for Drake to establish that he was seriously harmed, he would need to prove that the publication of the defamatory material causing either serious harm to his reputation or monetary loss. Interestingly, tying back into that case about Google, this was dealt with in the New South Wales court in the case of Scott and Bodley, where the court found that the publication of a negative review on an online platform did not amount to serious harm, as there was inconsistencies in proving that there was financial loss as a result. So applying this, obviously, I think Drake probably a lot more financially tied to this, but it'd be very difficult for Drake to establish that he suffered serious harm as a result of this diss track. This is as he was actually ranked as the #1 most streamed artist in 2024.
Yeah,
no
probably
surprises
brought in a lot of revenue from that.
Regardless of the diss track.
Yeah,
So,
interesting.
in fact, maybe even the diss track would have helped.
Promoted him a bit. He's soldiering on.
Free marketing.
And also he's sold out multiple arenas worldwide. Cancelled a few, unfortunately.
I was about to say, weren't you planning to
I was meant
go?
to be there, but so
Maybe next year.
yeah, definitely. But it's very difficult for him to establish that his reputation is damaged or he lost any income, because in fact he probably made money.
Yeah.
But a point to consider is tying back into the situation that you were talking about earlier, where he was actually, like, his security was shot.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because the courts haven't actually dealt with serious harm when it comes to physical. So we've talked about monetary loss and reputation, but actual physical harm, threat to life, is something that we probably have to consider.
Yeah.
Because obviously his security was injured, and then there could be more threats in the future as well.
Well, there were actually, in the end, there were 3 different intruders that came in 3 different scenarios over the course of a few days after the song was published.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the serious threat element, there were a few.
And with his, like you were mentioning before, like his house is pinned now.
I know.
People know. So so it really raises like a serious question on like how they would view this, but also damages.
Yeah.
Like, how do you attribute damages to this situation when there's like physical threat?
I know. It's going to be really interesting to see kind of the way that they choose to deal with it in America. In Australia, he could be awarded 2 different types of damages. So we do economic and non-economic damages. Economic damages cover things like lost revenue from cancelled concerts or sponsorships, and non-economic damages cover things like reputational damage or emotional distress. So that is where we'd kind of see that kind of side being brought in. I'd also be really curious to see kind of how they see how much reputational or profits were lost by Drake, because I'm curious whether he had any or if he actually saw a rise. Like I would love to see the stats on that. I feel like it would be so interesting. There's actually a catch though in Australia, so non-economic damages are capped unless the defendant acted with extreme malice or recklessness, which would be pretty difficult to prove. And that's really different from the US, where punitive damages can be really, really high. So ultimately, as Shaq said before, what does this mean for the industry? Because it's ultimately going to have a massive impact. So if Drake wins, it could mean that record labels have to rethink how they market and distribute music, especially diss tracks or any controversial content. So it might mean for the daily listeners, there's no more diss tracks to power us through our gym sessions. Labels might adopt stricter moderation policies to avoid getting into legal trouble. So this could really change how the industry handles rap feuds or public disputes. On the flip side, if UMG wins, it could set a precedent that diss tracks and controversial music content are protected speech under US defamation law. That would make it a lot harder for public figures like Drake to hold record labels accountable for what they distribute. So it's really interesting to kind of see what one is actually the better outcome. Regardless of whether Drake wins or loses, this case is going to have a ripple effect across the music and entertainment industries, whether that be greater regulations, a more cautious approach by record labels, or even a shift in how artists approach self-expression in music.
Yeah, it's really going to be quite groundbreaking.
It's a
in that
pretty
respect.
interesting case.
I think a lot of people will be following it.
I know. I mean, I feel like it's just brought so much attention to kind of the legal side of things as well, especially with music, because I mean, music is something where you can kind of get away with so much, or at least that's been the perception for everyone. Like, I mean, you hear the most rogue things in songs and you're just like, oh yeah,
It's
but
creative expression.
now you can see that
So
it
it's
can
like
be.
artistic expression, but then when does the law
Yeah.
jump in?
Where's the line draw?
to like limit that or
Yeah, but we'll leave that
expand it
to the
next.
audience.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And we'll stay tuned, see how it all works out.
See what happens.
Yeah, quite interesting.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.